All right, welcome back to the Black Male Archives podcast. I'm your host, Rodney Freeman, and we have with us Pastor Marvin Mims. Sir, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing great, Mr. Freeman. How you doing?
Man, I am good. I'm glad we have you on this podcast because I have a couple questions for you. And I definitely I was reading what you do. You're a pastor. You have some mentoring groups that you're doing. You wrote a book, so I am honored to talk to you and kind of just be able to pick your brain and see where you're from. So if you can tell the listeners where you're from and your background.
Well, thank you again, Mr. Freeman, for allowing me to be on your show. I am from Greenville, Mississippi. I was born there, came to Memphis, Tennessee after graduating from high school at the age of 18. And so I've been living here most of my adult life. I grew up, of course, in the Delta, middle class family. My parents were pretty much, hardworking people, worked in steel factories, but they grew up on the farm. And so they grew up in the Delta times of hard economic times in the 40s and 50s. But, that's kind of my background. But here
Yeah.
being in Memphis, as you alluded to, man, I've worn a lot of different hats. As a baseball coach, started a mentoring program called B.O.L.D Brothers in 2001. It's still in existence. It was a spinoff from the baseball organization that I started.
Mhm.
And then, of course, becoming a pastor in 2011. I'm sorry, 2021.
Mhm.
So just been doing a number of things here recently. But at the heart of my ministry is serving.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
giving back.
Yeah, I can see. I can read it. I mean, I read your bio and everything, and I see what drove that. Where does that come from? Where does that stem from?
Well, part of my background of who I am, the service part.
Hmm.
I grew up again in small town, Greenville, Mississippi, and I
Hmm.
always found myself, my passion was sports. I was a king of sandlot. That's what I called myself. I didn't play much organized school ball. It wasn't good enough to
Hmm.
make the team. I always got cut. But even in Greenville, in our small community, I was always organizing, community games within our community and spearheading, baseball, football, basketball games. And so that just kind of continued on in my adult life, uh, organizing baseball teams and then mentoring program. So and the church ministry that was already organized when I got involved with that. But again, I've organized some ministries with that. Started an organization called Man Hope with our church, and basically that's mentoring young men as well. Man Hope stands for Hour of Power Enrichment. And so
Yeah.
that's a program we started at church a few years ago. And then going back even to the mentoring program I started, B.O.L.D Brothers.
Hmm.
B.O.L.D stands for Brothers Offering Leadership Development. And
Hmm.
so that was started about the time of 9/11,
Okay.
9/11. And so just bringing men together to impact other young men, to teach them about leadership, to empower the young men to be leaders, family men, be responsible for their communities, to give back, to serve. And so that's the heart of who I am, serving.
Yeah. Yeah. And through that service, how have you the mentorships? Talk to us a little bit about those. Like when you started those mentorships, what was the goal and the purpose? I know we talked about you giving back, but what was the goal and the purpose for those young men coming through the program, and what
Yeah.
you want them to attain?
So that's a great question, Mr. Freeman. One, myself along with my assistant coaches that were working with me at the time, we were doing mentoring and didn't realize it. I mean, we were taking our young men on trips out of town. We were having leadership meetings with them, uh, taking them to various activities in the city, spending time with them, you know, dining with them, teaching them to respect one another, respect authority, respect women. And so, I mean, just the things that I experienced as a young man. I grew up two-parent family. Uh, my mother and father didn't have the best. I came out of a family that was domestic violence. My father was physically abusive to my mother, and so I vowed that I would never hit my wife. And so, coming from that environment, uh, family environment, I had uncles who always poured into me, always encouraged me, always gave. My dad was, and going back to my dad, he was a hardworking man. I think he grew up, you know, in the 70s, 60s, that was a time that there was a lot of physical abuse that was going on in relationships. And that's one of the things that the editor of my book was glad I talked about in my book, because she said even her family went through that. And we don't talk about that. And so she was glad I mentioned that. So even though I grew up in a two-parent family and my dad taught me how to work, there were some things I had to learn as a man, how to treat my wife, and how to be respectful, and how to love, and how to say I love you to other men, and to your spouse. And so those are the kind of things we wanted to teach young men. It's okay to show emotion. It's okay to hug one another. It's okay to embrace one another. And so all those things that we empower with our young men. And Mr. Freeman, one of the things I share with you, we started B.O.L.D Brothers in 2001. My wife and I started a church ministry in 2007. And it didn't go as planned. I mean, to be honest with you, that was one time that I faced depression, because I was expecting the ministry to grow.
Mm-hmm.
I was expecting it to flourish, and none of that took place. It became a youth ministry, and basically it died off. And so
Yeah.
I was at the crossroads.
Yeah.
Do I continue doing what I'm doing, or do I stop what I'm doing and go back home to my local church?
Yeah.
And so God led me and my wife back to our local church, and we committed even more to helping my father-in-law, who I write about in my book. He was
Mm-hmm.
growing up in age, and so we began to help him out more. We began to do ministry in parts of the most impoverished parts of Memphis, which is an area, really the poorest areas in the state of Tennessee. It's called the 38126 zip code.
Mm-hmm.
And so coming out of that depression, God showed me that I still had a purpose. It wasn't about trying to make a church ministry work. It was about doing ministry.
Yeah.
And so I didn't lose my calling. Some friends thought I was going to stop preaching. I said, no, I'm not stopping preaching. I'm just stopped doing what I'm doing. Many times we try to, you heard the phrase, what stupidity is doing the same thing over and over again,
Yeah. Yeah.
expecting
Yeah.
different results.
You're right. Right.
So I stopped the church thing and began to do church outside the walls.
Yeah.
And that's when God really even blew up my ministry more. And subsequently became the pastor of our local church. My father-in-law got up in age, and he handed the church over to me, passed the church over to me. And so then I was able to incorporate my service mentality into our local church. We had gotten away from doing ministry in the community and focusing on internal programs, the things that don't really impact ministry,
Mm-hmm.
and so we began to engage in the community,
Yeah.
serving the community meals, providing food and clothing for those that needed it, offering the COVID vaccination to our community, because we were one of the last ones to receive it, our church area in the city of Memphis, because, it was like one of those things that, those that need it the most, those who can't afford it, that's who
Yeah.
got it last.
Right.
And so those are the kind of things that we were able to do and impact change at our local church, because our church, so I talked about my ministry dying at one time before I came
Yeah.
home to our local church. Our local church was dying as well,
Yeah.
because we were losing our young people.
Yeah.
Uh, and we were not, so young people wanted to be connected with the church. They wanted to see us serving
Right.
rather than just coming in, preaching and teaching and then fighting over power,
Right. Right.
locally.
So speaking to that, can you talk to us a little bit, and before we get into your book, and can you talk to us a little bit about how the leadership that you have, and the mentor programs that you have, and the people that you seen come through in the city of Memphis, what would you say to the officers that doing the Trey Nichols situation? If you had a chance to speak to those officers, what would you say to them?
Well, that's another good question, a great question. And I'm going to deal with that in two parts. The first part is, it was 20 years ago that I mentioned to you that we started B.O.L.D Brothers, and it was about 2014, and my wife and I had a local church ministry that actually functioned out of our house. And so we kept it going for a few years. But man, that was 2014. So we ended at about 2016.
Mm-hmm.
Several years later, young men would stop by our house,
Mm-hmm.
and they were thankful that we ministered to them, that we gave them a place, that we opened up our house as a place of spiritual teaching for them.
Yeah.
And so that was powerful. That they had some of them had been incarcerated, but they still
Mm-hmm.
came back to say, Mr. Mims, man, we remember Bible study at your house, remember having church at your house. And so how it impacted their lives. I mean, that's something that you can't put a tangible dollar amount on. And
Yeah.
so there are many other individuals that we impacted. Coaching baseball, 20 years ago, kids would come back and they'd see me in the city and say, Coach Mims, and many of these kids I didn't even recognize.
Yeah.
So that's one part of that. The second part, which you talked about, what would I say to the officers regarding Tariq Nicholas? I'm involved with a ministerial association called the Memphis Baptist Ministerial Association. A
Mm-hmm.
few years ago, the police chief, not the current police chief, but the former police chief, came through our meeting,
Mm-hmm.
and they came really seeking for help from the church to get
Yeah.
involved to stem juvenile crime and violence and all that. And so my question to the police chief then, which was about 4 years ago, was, well, what about community policing in our community and having feet on the ground? Uh, Unfortunately, he kind of blew me off, and he said, we don't have enough cops to put on the ground to cover all the square miles of Memphis. And looking back on that now, Mr. Freeman, what I was
Mm-hmm.
really asking for was boots on the ground,
Mm-hmm.
patrolmen on the ground in the
Mm-hmm.
area where it's most needed. You got
Mm-hmm.
like the hood, not
Right.
all over Memphis. And so
Right.
I still firmly believe today that police or community policing will make an impact, because now you're establishing a relationship
Yeah.
with the community
Right.
rather than just driving around responding to crime.
Right.
And so those police officers, unfortunately, uh, we know didn't have a relationship with the community. It doesn't take a rocket science to
Mm.
figure that out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so how do you fix that? Uh, I still believe community policing is one of the solutions.
Is the best way to go. Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree. Because it's all about relationships, right? And if you
Right.
can be able to harness that relationships in those times, maybe things like that wouldn't happen. So, well, I thank you for that. Let's talk about your book real quick. Just tell us about your book. You've kind of been dropping some gems throughout the interview, but tell us just a little bit about the book, and then yeah, we'll let the listeners know where they can pick it up.
Okay. So again, the book is called The Crossroads of Champions. I started out writing about my father-in-law in 2014, about his life, and at the well, I didn't continue with that project, and so then the pandemic hit in 2019, 2020. So I began to pick up the writing again about my father-in-law, who had been a pastor for 50 years. And about the same time, I realized I had a story to tell. So what I did was I did one book, and so it's autobiography about myself, a biography about him. But the Crossroads of Champions is about how our lives intersect. Of course, I began talking about manhood growing up as a young person and things that impacted me. But then coming to Memphis at an early age, and then meeting my wife, who I'm married to now. We got engaged, got married at a young age. I was 19, she was 18. And so I established an immediate connection with my father-in-law. And so from that, we served 4 years in the Air Force at Scott Air Force Base in Illinois. And we came back to Memphis to live. And so serving here in Memphis and working here in Memphis, of course, quite naturally, we connected with my father-in-law's church. And so I became a deacon under his leadership. And so that's the manhood, the marriage with my wife. Uh, I talk about the military, having served 32 years in the military, and then ministry, going back to Reverend Backus, having served under him as a deacon, but also being called into the ministry on his leadership. So all that intertwines, but there's separate chapters that focus on my life, and then there's separate chapters that focus on his life. But all throughout the book, I'm talking about our relationship.
Yeah, 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 and that's good. What do you want the readers to take away from your book?
Now, that is a powerful question. So in my book, even though I deal with manhood, marriage, military, and ministry, there's some key points I bring out about mental health. Because in the military, I dealt with a lot of racism, and so I had to know how to deal with that, and not being angry, what we call an angry black man. And so mental health is important. And even that connects with religion, because a lot of times, I think I talked about it earlier, we don't talk about that in the church. And so the wellness of mental health and religion. And so the takeaways is, for young African American men, how do you deal with the challenge of racism? We see it every day, laws being changed. So how do you deal with racism? How do you deal with discrimination? How do you deal with depression? And at the end of the day, if you fight strategically, if you fight godly, you'll see yourself as a champion. And that's what one of the takeaways for the book for me is the ability to become a champion.
Yeah, that's very powerful, man. Well, I definitely appreciate this. Can you tell the listeners about any projects that you have working on that you're doing in Memphis right now, and then also tell them where they can follow you on social media?
Okay, well, I begin with the last question. So you can follow me on social media at the Crossroads of Champions. I have a website, thecrossroadsofchampions.com. Uh, Also, my email is BOLD, B-O-L-D, TN04 @yahoo.com. I'm on Instagram as well. You can find me there. I'm on Facebook, Marvin Mims Senior. So I'm on a lot of different social media platforms. If someone's interested in getting the book, you can actually email me as well, boldtn04 @yahoo.com. My book is also on Amazon. It's in paperback, but also e-Kindle, and so you can get it through those means as well. What am I involved with right now? I am heavily involved with the organization. Again, I share with you the Memphis Baptist Ministerial Association, and so we are involved with, basically ministry with a lot of different churches working together to address some of the issues that we face in our city: education, crime. With our local church at St. Mark that I pastor, just started an initiative this month. On the third Sunday of each month, we take out time during worship to read with our children for 10 minutes. We bring a book to worship, and then we give that child that book. And so that's a new project that we started this month, and we're going to continue that each month, taking time out of worship, reading with a child for 10 minutes, going back into worship, but also giving that child that book. And that's designed to mentor, empower the child to read, empower the parent to read with the child. There's so many different ways that this is going to be a blessing to
Yeah.
children and adults, and we're highlighting it every month.
Yeah. Oh man, this is great. You're doing great work in the community. I appreciate you being on here and telling your story and talking about your book and you know uh, what's going on in Memphis. I appreciate your time, sir. Pastor Marvin Mims, thank you, sir, for being on the Black Male Archives, where we capture, curate, and promote positive stories about Black men, which you are one of. Thank you, sir, for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman. It's my honor. But God bless
Thank
you.
Awesome. Thank you. Same to
All
you.
right. All right.